For your service. Additionally, Wade is a renowned Civil War historian, an author, and a speaker. He is also a tour guide of the Friends of Bentonville Battlefield, and he's working on the Wise Forks effort, as John has also mentioned. In addition, he has recently become a boat captain, and he's adding that to his resume. So please, welcome Wade Sokolosky.
John and Ann, thank you so much for the warm hospitality as always. I was telling them at dinner tonight, just shy of 8 years to the date was the first time I ever came here. Then Mike Powell, who was president, and Wally, I think you were vice president at the time. Well, those two gentlemen took a chance on a local boy here in eastern North Carolina, and I really enjoyed it. It was my first opportunity, and I've forgotten how many times I've been back now. So it's always a pleasure to come here to speak at the largest roundtable in America. And to those who couldn't make it tonight, who are out there in Zoom land on your computer, thank you for tuning in tonight, or signing on, or whatever you say when it goes to Zoom. Well, tonight, we're going to look at a topic. Those of you who know me, I'm usually 1865 orientated, Carolina's campaign. And tonight, I'm going to talk about what I describe as a dance between two great rivers, the Great Petey River and where Fayetteville is located at on the Cape Fear River. For a little more than about 10 days, there's a lot of chaos and a lot of drama going on. And Sherman's boys are just marching on and taking advantage of all this chaos and drama. But tonight I'm going to talk about that. And the next slide, please. Because it was going to be a primer to what was going to be a tour of the Monroe's Crossroads battlefield at modern-day Fort Liberty. Used to be Fort Bragg. In March of '65, there's 4 major battles fought in this state. The first one is Wise's Forks. The second one is Monroe's Crossroads, and then Aversboro, and all roads lead to Bentonville, the big one at Bentonville. But it's usually, because it's nestled in the training areas back there on the back 40 of Bragg, the Army takes very close care of that, and it's really hard to get on. And I usually only go to the well once a year, and we were going to try to do it on the 17th. And this is why this was a primer for it. But unfortunately, technical reasons, logistics reasons ran into it. So we're going to, those of you who heard about this, we're thinking about it, we're excited about it, because honestly, Monroe's Crossroads, because of the difficulty of getting there, is usually high on someone's bucket list of knocking off Civil War battlefields. But I promise you, I'm only allowed one time a year. We're going to put it to the back burner, and John and I are going to figure out some dates later on this year that we can get a couple vehicles up in there for those of you who are really into the mounted fight. And you can see where Kilpatrick's shirt-tail skedaddle took care of. And I'll talk a little bit about that tonight. Next slide, please. Now, this is a question for all you who've heard me before. It's the anniversary of the Carolinas campaign. Sherman's army is on the move. Anybody know what major battle occurred this week, 159 years ago in South Carolina? Anybody take a guess? Rivers Bridge on the Sokolosky. Sherman's still down in the swamps in the low country. And the Confederates banked on this static defensive line. And a guy by the name of Joseph Mower, the swamp lizard, you know him from Bentonville on the last day, he punched a hole through that line. And it opened up the path. And now we're out of the swamps and we're moving uphill toward Columbia. Rivers Bridge. If you're ever traveling south down towards Savannah on I-95, you'll see a little sign for it. It's a state park. And honestly, folks, if it almost, you think you're in, those of you familiar with Fort Anderson, you almost think you're standing in Fort Anderson when you go there. Maybe 4 or 5 feet lower in height, but just as big. So if you're ever traveling, it's like 25 miles off the road, off the interstate, it's out in the middle of nowhere, well worth your time. I say go in the fall, go when it's cold. You ain't got to worry because you're in the swamps. So it's good, right on the Sokolosky River there. Next slide, please. That was the answer. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. All right, folks, those of you who've heard me speak before, bear with me for a few moments. Because there may be a few people in this room who don't know who this guy is. I bet you're not from South Carolina or Georgia. All right? So let me give a few moments here to set the stage for those. Maybe this could be the first time you ever heard of Sherman. It's Christmas of 1864. Major General William Tecumseh Sherman has just completed his famous March to the Sea from Atlanta to Savannah. And he presents the city of Savannah to President Abraham Lincoln as a Christmas gift. And then the big question is what to do with an army of 60,000 Union soldiers. There's really no Confederate army left. I mean, John Bell Hood went off into Tennessee. Hardee's hanging up around Charleston now. Sherman's boss, Ulysses S. Grant, wants that army put on vessels as quickly as possible and sent north to Virginia, where if you put another 50 to 60,000 infantry in the siege lines around Petersburg and Richmond, where Bobby Lee is all bottled up, it would quickly turn him out into the open. Boom, lights out, game's over, war's over. And that's what Grant wants to do. But there's simply not enough boats to do it. And it plays right into Sherman's hand because he wants to march north. And he recommends to his boss, I can get there just as quick by marching. So Grant will approve that plan for Sherman to march. Now, he will not leave until 1 February and make that move north. But it's important for us down in this neck of the woods, the lower Cape Fear River, because the minute Grant approved Sherman's plan, guess what? All of a sudden, Fort Fisher, Fort Anderson, and Wilmington, because of the railroad, becomes important to General Grant. And all of a sudden, you have the Second Battle of Fort Fisher, Fort Anderson, and eventually the fall of Wilmington. Now, when Sherman moves north, he's going to... Next slide, please. If you look at the dark gray shaded area, you kind of see how Sherman's coming up out of Savannah. On the far right of that gray area is the right wing of his army under the command of Major General Oliver O. Howard. Those of you who studied Gettysburg often called O. Howard. And then on the far left is another Gettysburg veteran, Major General Henry Slocum. Okay, Slocum. The Gettysburg guys always get me on that, okay? But ultimately, he's doing that to keep the Confederates off balance. Sherman doesn't care about Charleston. Charleston's a wasted target. That's not going to defeat Robert E. Lee. Augusta? No. You can build all the powder you want. You don't have the railroads to get it anywhere. Lee is the objective. He is the center of gravity. You take out Lee, the ball game's over with. And Sherman's marching straight, and before he ever left Savannah, at the John Green House, which still stands today, you can take a tour there, he put his finger on the map. I'm going to Columbia. I'm going to Cheraw. I'm going to Fayetteville, and ultimately Goldsboro, where I want supplies coming in from Wilmington, up north on the Wilmington and Weldon, or coming over from my neck of the woods by Morehead City and Beaufort on the Atlantic in North Carolina. So Sherman has his eyes on Goldsboro the whole time, because it's about 450 miles from Savannah to Goldsboro. And ladies and gentlemen, they're not all marching up I-95. Okay? They have no supply lines. So as one Confederate says, about 40 miles a crow would starve across from one side of the army to the other. But they're moving north. And the whole time they're deceiving the Confederates. Next slide. Now, the gentleman in charge is Pierre Beauregard. You see him right there smack in the middle of the map. But on the far left is D.H. Hill, Daniel Harvey Hill, from the Army of Tennessee. He's in Augusta. The Army of Tennessee is flowing in from Tupelo. On the far right, around Charleston, is General Hardee. And you see Sherman coming smack up the middle because the Confederates are trying to defend every key spot they can. But, oh, by the way, you're outnumbered about 4-1. All right, so that's not helping. And if Beauregard falls right to it. Now, on that map, you see I have another gentleman up there, a famous North Carolinian, everyone's favorite general, Braxton Bragg. He's over here at Wilmington. All right, Fort Fisher's fallen. It's up to him to make sure we don't lose Wilmington. Now, the reason I have Beauregard and Bragg the same size, because they're equal. They're both generals. But who's in charge? Who's in charge? If Beauregard asks for help from Bragg or vice versa, I got my own problems. You deal with it. They work for Robert E. Lee, who's now the General-in-Chief of all Confederate military forces. And oh, by the way, he's got his hands full in Virginia, you think? Around Petersburg and Richmond. All right, so in military terms, there's an old saying, principle of war, unity of command. There can only be one dude in charge, or dudette, okay? Only one person in charge. And here we're violating that, and Sherman's taking advantage of it. Next slide. Now, Sherman's moving so quick. Columbia, South Carolina, falls on February 17th. Boop, there goes another state capital. And 5 days later, guess what? Wilmington falls. So Confederate President Jefferson Davis is having a very bad month of February. Okay? And he's under a lot of pressure to do something. Next slide. Upon recommendation of the General-in-Chief, Robert E. Lee says, you know what, you need to reappoint Joseph Eggleston Johnston. And you all have heard me say, President Davis and Joseph Eggleston Johnston are not sending each other Christmas cards or birthday cards. They don't get along. Davis does not want him. He never. But ultimately, Johnston will accept it. And he initially takes it with, okay, wait a minute. All right, it's the fourth quarter of a football game. It's a 2-minute warning. We're down by 6 touchdowns. Why are you bringing me back now? You fired me. Now you want me to come back. Why? And it took a little bit of Johnston's political connections, Senator Wigfall and a few others, that said, no, Lee was really, to his heart, thought you were the only one that could cobble this thing together. And it kind of changed his mind. He said, okay, boss, I'll take it. But then he fires back when he read Lee's orders. Turn back Sherman? You want me to turn back Sherman? With what? Okay? And oh, by the way, if you look at the very bottom, if you go back where I had Beauregard and Bragg is the same size, well, guess what? Bragg is still sitting over here in Wilmington, or the area here. They've evacuated, of course, around Goldsboro. But Bragg is still sitting there as an independent commander with one of the largest Confederate divisions, Robert Hoke's. Those of you who have been with Doc Fonville on the Sugarloaf line, that was Robert F. Hoke's line. It's one of Johnston's largest divisions. And he can't control them. General Bragg, do you mind if I borrow a couple brigades? No, that's not how we operate. And Johnston went back to Lee and said, hey, unity of command. And Johnston got Bragg. Now, of course, Bragg immediately pens a letter to Jefferson Davis. Please, please, please remove me from this embarrassing situation. Now, I've never found Davis's response, but obviously he either just disregarded it, said, I got bigger problems to fish to fry right now, instead of egos. And Bragg will stay under command all the way through the Battle of Bentonville. So that's our command and control Confederate-wise. Next slide, please. On February 25th, he will write Lee back. And you see that blue triangle in the middle, in the gray area? Johnston describes in a letter that Sherman's army is like Sherman's armies is like a triangle. And we've got the Army of Tennessee over in Augusta on one side. We've got Braxton Bragg on the top of it up here in North Carolina. And we got poor General Hardee, which I didn't tell you. He's in Charleston on the day that Columbia falls. So he's really playing catch-up with everybody. And in Johnston's mind is, Sherman can, if he gets in trouble, he just brings all his boys together. And oh, by the way, the only place that we can really unite the Confederate forces is at the bottom of the triangle. And oh, by the way, Sherman just keeps on moving. That is Johnston's dilemma when he takes charge. And even General Hampton, Wade Hampton, years after the war, wrote, "It would scarcely have been possible to disperse a force more effectively." That is what Johnston has been handed. Next slide. If we look at the map here, Columbia fell on February 17th. It's back here. Here's the Great PD River, the North Carolina-South Carolina line. And General Hardee, believe it or not, actually got to beat Sherman to Cheraw. Although he was still in Charleston, the weather was merciless against Sherman's engineers, and there are constantly creeks and rivers are swollen. It's slowing up Sherman. Oh, by the way, we had to put out a fire in Columbia. Okay? So Hardee was able to get the bulk of his forces to Cheraw about a day or two before Sherman gets there. But here they come. And this is almost the first week of March right here. And look at the Confederate cavalry. You think they're in the position, the right position? Cavalry should be out front here. This is your infantry. You want your cavalry here. Look where they're at. They're way behind too. Next slide. Now on March 3rd, this is Anson County. This is North Carolina, South Carolina line. This is the modern-day town of Wadesboro. And for several days, boy, Sherman's foragers like to hit Wadesboro for goodies. Now, this will be the first cavalry action, and it's a little-known battle. Dr. John G. Barrett in Civil War, North Carolina, he mentions this battle in a couple pages. But it's significant as a cavalry engagement because, one, this is Wade Hampton and all the Confederate cavalry just about. And here is Judson Kilpatrick, Sherman's cavalry chieftain, who only has 4 brigades, and one of them is walking because they've lost all their horses. They're dismounted. But what's happening here is Hampton and Wheeler pick up on the fact that Kilpatrick is strung out on a long road. You don't even see his other brigade that's operating farther south. So on the morning of March 4th, next slide, we're going to have a good little cavalry battle in this little square here all day long until finally late in the afternoon, Kilpatrick is able to consolidate his division before he moves over here at Sneedsboro, where a pontoon bridge is supposed to be built by the engineers. Now, why is this battle significant? Monroe's Crossroads is what? 6 days later, less than a week. And once again, Kilpatrick will get caught with his brigades strung out. And I'm going to show you. He survives this one. What is going to be a different story on Monroe's Crossroads. But it just shows how Kilpatrick is not being very disciplined. He doesn't have a lot of respect for Wade Hampton and Joe Wheeler, and they're getting ready to teach him a lesson. Next slide, please. Now, on March 3rd, simultaneously, when the cavalry are duking it out up there in Anson County, down in Cheraw, the swamp lizard. I just had a Brigadier General Joseph Mower, excuse me. He's promoted to Major General afterwards. But Mower's division will make it to Cheraw, and they will try to get across the wooden bridge. Now, this is the exact bridge that was built on the same trestles after Wade Hampton and Hardee burnt when they evacuated Cheraw. All the Confederates were on the opposite side, but it was a covered bridge on the morning that Mower's forces showed up, and the Confederates had put rosin and tar, all kinds of naval store kind of stuff inside and around that bridge, and it went up like a light stick. So Sherman's boys weren't able to get across the river, but Hardee was able to evacuate just about everything. Unfortunately, he did not have enough wagons. Next slide. And you see a lot of the cannons. I want to say it was 50-some cannons that were captured there, but all kinds of munitions and stuff. But Sherman's army will hang out in Cheraw for about 3 or 4 days because, one, they need to get the pontoon bridges across the Great Petee River. In the meantime, Hardee has evacuated. He's on the opposite side. Next slide. This is where O.O. Howard's wing, the right wing, will cross. This is a part in Cheraw down on the Great Petee River. You can see it's actually flooded a little bit at that stage right there. But during this time, the river was really up. March of '65 was one of the wettest months in the Carolinas. So all your rivers are rain swollen. And this is where the right wing will cross. And you see the pontoon bridges that Sherman's engineers used. They didn't use the wooden bateau like you see a lot in the Army of the Potomac. They were frames that folded. And you just folded them up. Then you put them on a piece of canvas, tie it off on the cleats, then put your bridging material across. That's how Sherman's engineers. This will be the crossing of the right wing right in downtown Cheraw. Next slide. Then the left wing, and also where the cavalry, with Slocum's boys and the cavalry will cross. This is the actual crossing site. I'm standing for the left wing. Now, this proved a little bit more challenging. You see, the Great Petee is a little bit more wider. They didn't have enough boats. Now, you talk about an engineering feat here. The engineers will build about 250 to 300 feet of trestle out into the river, and then they will tie the boats off to it to continue to bridge across. So eventually, they are across the bridge here. Next slide. Now, I'm not going to give you a class on Clausewitz or Jomini or anything like that, but this is one of the classic examples when we talk about friction and fog of war. These three gentlemen right here, that very first week of March in the dance between the two great rivers. Next slide. Just real quick, think of fog. It's the uncertainty, where there's uncertainty about yourself or the enemy. And then friction, it's either indecisiveness, what Sherman's army is doing, the swollen rivers are doing, or lack of defined or unclear or complicated plans. Hang on to that, folks. Hang on to that one. Next slide. Now, here is Cheraw, Fayetteville, Raleigh, Greensboro, Charlotte. Now, I don't normally do this. I'm usually pretty good to talk things off my head, but I'm going to read something to you, folks. This is a series of dispatches between those three generals, Johnston, Hardee, and Beauregard. They even got one here from Bragg from Wilmington, too, as well. On February 24th, Beauregard from Charlotte will tell Hardee, who's just now reaching Cheraw, that you will cross the river when you have to, move north to Rockingham, and then 130 miles to the northwest over to Charlotte. General Hardee will begin that movement. Remember, Sherman shows up on the 2nd. The very next day, Hardee makes that move. He's moving north. It takes him 2 days to go from those two little red dots there. Now remember, Hardee's army has a lot of what we call red infantry. Just like you had heavy artillerymen at Caswell here, Fort Anderson, Fort Fisher. When all these forts fell and Wilmington fell, there's no more big guns to man. And Johnston needed infantry. So he created the red infantry. Well, the same thing is happening coming out of Georgia and South Carolina. All the forts, the big forts that protected Charleston and Savannah, Hardee has a bunch of red infantry. Honestly, Sherman's boys, who've been marching all the way from Chattanooga to Atlanta to Savannah and now going back up, that little skip and a hop there between them two, doesn't begin in one day. But you see, it took General Hardee, because they're used to hanging out on the coast eating oysters and shrimp. So they're not physically fit as Sherman's boys per se. But see, that's where Hardee's headed to. Now, on February 26th, General Hardee received another dispatch from Beauregard that said, now, you know what? Nope, you need to go to Fayetteville. And oh, by the way, the very next day, he gets a message from General Bragg in Wilmington. General Hardee, you better be careful. You're going to Fayetteville because General Schofield is marching up the Cape Fear River to take Fayetteville. Now, we know that's not true. But it goes back to that friction, the fog, the uncertainty of what the enemy is doing and how it impacts it. Well, Hardee goes, well, if Schofield's going to be at Fayetteville, I just soon head to Greensboro, to the left of Johnston. Who, oh, by the way, that's where Johnston happens to be on the 4th of March. And General Johnston will send a message to Hardee. I'll see you in Fayetteville in a few days. Hardee's not going to Fayetteville. He's now going to Goldsboro. And somehow along the two couriers must have passed along the same road, because that very same day, there's a message that's sent to Johnston from Hardee that tells him, hey, boss, I'll see you in Greensboro. And Johnston's like, what the heck happened? He gets Beauregard, Bragg, they're all coming up with all kinds of excuses. In the meantime, Johnston will send another message to Hardee that says, I need you to go to Fayetteville, not Greensboro. And then Johnston's like, the uncertainty kicks in. Well, wait a minute. Sherman's probably going to beat him to Fayetteville. And we know Schofield's not going there. But can he outdistance Sherman in a foot race to Fayetteville? So he changes the orders. Now he wants General Hardee to go to Raleigh, to the right of Johnston. And by the time Hardee gets these on March 7th, he writes back, a very frustrated General Hardee, and says, boss, I'll see you in Fayetteville in 2 days. And they will meet. But this is this crazy dance between these two great rivers. And remember, Johnston is trying to get in front of that triangle and concentrate his forces. But you can see how Sherman and his feints towards Charlotte, his feints towards wherever he's going, is confusing the Confederates. Next slide, please. Now, just north of where, you remember several slides back where I pointed out how Wade Hampton and the Confederate cavalry were like in the wrong spot. They're way behind, all right? Well, they're trying to get across the Cape Fear River, and the Confederate cavalry do not have pontoon bridges. But here's a place called Grassy Island up in Anson County, North Carolina. And this is where General Willard will demonstrate, talking about personal leadership. He literally swims his horse across this great river to Grassy Island, gains his composure, pats the horse on the neck, let's do it again, and get to the other side. And he literally demonstrates to his horsemen, this is how you can do it. We don't need a bridge. And it worked. Next slide. This is the area I'm talking about right here with Grassy Island. You can see where Wheeler is coming across right here at Grassy Island. Hampton went a little farther north where he was able to find a more suitable, because the river is much lower, much narrower up there. They were able to find a ford and get across. But you see now, look where Hardee is. All right? He went north because he thought he was supposed to go to Greensboro. He's out of position. Wheeler here, finally the Confederates are going to be able to consolidate, at least in this general area here. But unfortunately, Sherman's army is already going this way. Next slide. And here we are. We're finally approaching the Great Cape Fear. And here's Fayetteville. You see the two wings of the army. General Hardee is barely a day march in front of these guys. They're closing it up on them. And you see Hampton is still desperately trying to catch up with the Confederate infantry that's moving into Fayetteville. Next slide. It was here at Laurel Hill Church that General Sherman, this is about maybe 40, 50 miles to the southwest of Fayetteville. Sherman's getting close. He sends out a series of scouts to make their way through Confederate lines to get down here to Wilmington, to Admiral Porter, General Terry, somebody in charge. And this will be the first time that anyone in an official capacity, other than reading Confederate newspapers, this is the first time Sherman will ever make official contact with a fellow general officer. And Corporal Pike's story is amazing because he goes from Laurel Hill, he makes it to Wilmington. Oh, by the way, they go, well, General Schofield's up in New Bern at Kinston fighting the Battle of Wise's Fort. But we'll put you on a boat and send you up New Bern. He makes his way over New Bern to Kinston. The Battle of Wise's Fork is over. And General Schofield says, I need you to get a message to Sherman for me. Oh, by the way, you got to go through Confederate territory again. On the first night of the Battle of Bentonville on March 19th, Corporal Pike will walk into Sherman's tents and hand him the messages from Schofield. Talk about a pretty daring run here is Corporal Pike. Next slide, please. Now, on March 9th, Johnston will meet Hardee in Fayetteville. And this will be the last face-to-face they have until almost 10 days later, until Bentonville. And it's at this meeting here in downtown Fayetteville that Johnston will tell Hardee, I've made the decision to give up Fayetteville. See, Johnston had a thought of using the Cape Fear River, a major terrain feature. We stack our infantry on one side, maybe we can hold up Sherman. But the trouble was, remember I said there was 4 battles in 14 short days? Well, Wise's Fort, General D.H. Hill and General Hoke just captured over 1,100 Federals on the first day of the Battle of Wise's Fort. And Johnston said, you know what? I'm going to reinforce success. So everybody Hardee that I was going to send to you, Army of Tennessee Wise that was flowing in, I'm going to send to Kinston. Because the problem that Johnston's dealing with is, yeah, he's got that 60,000 that's in that triangle, but there's another 30,000 Federals coming up from Wilmington or New Bern, and everybody's going to Goldsboro. So Johnston knew he had to turn back one of those sides, and he thought he had the opportunity. And that's why, from an operational perspective, he literally has to give up Fayetteville. He tells Hardee, continue on towards Smithfield. All right, you have the flexibility to engage Sherman if you can, but do not lose your force. That's why we had the Battle of Averysboro 4 days later, 5 days later. But he also orders Wade Hampton to do the rear guard action to make sure all the Confederates get across the river. Now that's March 9th. Next slide. The second battle of the 4 in North Carolina, Monroe's Crossroads. There's no infantry at this one, gang. This is strictly mounted. This is a horse fight. And it's on the morning of March 10th. Next slide. We'll have the battle, but let me just show you here real quick. Here's the tail end of General Hardee. This is the rear, the boys in the rear. barely trying to get to Fayetteville. Look who's nipping on their tails here. Here comes the 14th Corps. You've got infantry here. Here's the Union Cavalry. This is the Southern Pines, Pinehurst area of North Carolina, is where this is. And this is modern-day Fort Liberty. Next slide. On the wee hours, 1 a.m. on 10 March, finally Hampton's cavalry has caught up to this point right here. Judson Kilpatrick and 2 of his brigades are encamped at the Monroe House. The rest of his brigades, here's one of them, still back over in Pinehurst, and here's another one that's trying desperately to get there. But what's happening at 1 o'clock in the morning, you've got these soldiers that have been in the saddle for hours. Hampton has had his boys, his troopers have been in the saddle for a long time because they're trying to play catch up. And everyone's tired. It's a dark night. There's no moon. You've only got these big, tall, long-leaf pines, and you're on a sandy road. Before you know it, you're wandering along, and you tap the guy on the back, and, hey, what's going on? Well, you know where we're going? And all of a sudden, he's not from Alabama. You literally had the intermingling of Federal troopers and Confederate troopers on this road. And ladies and gentlemen, Judson Kilpatrick was almost captured. He lost most of his headquarters security detachment, but he kind of had to go down in here in the swamp and work his way around. The problem is, once again, Judson Kilpatrick, he's spread out. Now, he thinks they all went on to Fayetteville. So really, when they go to bed at night on Monroe's Crossroads, they're all the kind of the pickets, the vedettes or whatever, they're all orientated towards Fayetteville. Because if the Confederates turn around, that's where they're going to come from. They do not realize that the bulk of Wade Hampton, all the Confederate cavalry, is behind them to the west. And it's during the night, this sleepy little camp here, that Wheeler will send in some of his Terry's Texas Rangers, Shannon Scouts. And these boys are good. And they literally get into this camp, walk around, find out that General Kilpatrick is shacked up in a house with some lady he picked up along the way. And 2 of the brigade commanders are in that same house. So all the senior leadership is in one house. And oh, by the way, because they were trying to be stealth, they walked in. They rode out. They stole some horses on the way out. And they tell Wheeler and Hampton. And this is where Hampton comes up with the plan. Next slide. Now, this is important that I share this with you. Wade Hampton is definitely got a grudge. These are his 3 childhood homes in Columbia, South Carolina. We know what happened to Columbia, right? He's lost a brother in the war, lost a son in the war, and one of his other sons is still recovering. So he's really a lot of sacrifices, and he's really ticked off at Sherman. And he's looking for a chance. And this is his opportunity. Next slide. They're going to weigh into Kilpatrick. Here's the house right here. This is where Kilpatrick is in there, the Monroe House. And what Hampton's plan is, it's going to be an L shape. The Army of Northern Virginia Cavalry under Butler will attack from the north. And over here across Nicholson Swamp, the entire Army of Tennessee Cavalry will launch into them. Now, these two, Kilpatrick and Wheeler, were at West Point together. They were classmates. And Wheeler literally picked 2 captains. Your only mission, your sole mission in life is to ride up to that house and get me Judson Kilpatrick. Bring him to me. And the wee hours of the morning, just as the sunrise, you've got morning nautical twilight, the bugles will sound. Wheeler even suggested to Hampton, why don't we do this on foot? And Hampton said, no, we're going to do it mounted. And when the bugle sounded, Butler's cavalry just came crashing down all around this area here. Wheeler's cavalry is having a bit of a trouble because the one thing the scouts failed to figure out was, you know what? You can probably walk across that creek, but taking a big old horse through a muddy swamp, they're going to bog down. And this is where the Confederate plan starts to fall apart. Most of the Confederate cavalry cannot get across the creek here. They're very successful coming in from the north. But the problem with these three units down here from Ohio, Kentucky, and Michigan, they're armed with some kind of repeating rifle, whether it's a Henry or a Spencer. And what that means, ladies, there's a lot of firepower. You can extend a lot of ammunition, and that's just enough to stop this initial attack. Now, oh, by the way, those two officers that Wheeler picked were in this group, and they ride up to that house. And Judson Kilpatrick comes out in his underwear. That's where you get the shirt tail skedaddle piece. And they, hey, have you seen General Kilpatrick? He went that way. And there they went. And Kilpatrick left the other two brigade commanders in the house along with his lady friend, and he ran south where those other units were. They're going to start to rally down in this part of the battlefield on the southern end. Now, eventually, next slide. Eventually, most of Wheeler's cavalry will now move around to the north, and they will attempt again several charges throughout the morning. And understand, folks, this battlefield, maybe a football and a half. It's not very long. It's very compact. There's a lot of horses in one area. They will attempt to charge again, but unfortunately you have so much firepower here now. And also, which I failed to point out, Kilpatrick's chief of scouts, Captain Northup, he said, you know what? We're not going to sleep in a house. That looks like a very inviting target. We're going to go hide in the swamps. And if anyone comes after us, we can hear them coming. So once he heard all this fighting going on, he mounts up and he starts moving to the sound of the guns. And some of the Confederates perceived that as reinforcements. Although it's just a company of scouts, it was enough to tip the Confederates to think, oh, they got reinforcements coming. Now, at the end of the day, Kilpatrick will control this battlefield. Hampton gives it up because now the road to Fayetteville is wide open. Now, why is the Battle of Monroe so important to General Hardee? It stopped Sherman's advance for one day. And that's all he really needed, was to get Hampton's boys across the river and to get all his infantry and artillery across the river. Because this is March 10th. Sherman arrives in Fayetteville on March 11th. So it's precious time, precious hours that were bought. Next slide. Now, there's Mr. Shirttail Skedaddle. There's a lot of writing about her name was Alice. She was her and her mother were traveling, but come to find out, Dr. Bradley years ago, when he was writing a book on it, he found a letter in Howard. General Howard had written to his wife saying, "Hey, baby, if you hear about this nice-looking lady and her daughter traveling with the headquarters, just be aware that they're just traveling with a whole bunch of refugees linked on to Sherman's army. And she was trying to get back north. That wasn't them. That's not the family. As one of these Alabama officers remember her as a redhead with maybe one tooth gone or something. Yeah, I mean, Kilpatrick was a widower. I mean, he lost his wife early in the war. But the latter part of it, he becomes a regular old womanizer. Next slide, please. Now, here we are in Fayetteville. Right after Gettysburg, back in the summer of '63, the commander of the commander of the Confederate arsenal, Frederick L. Childs, received permission to build a series of defenses along the Cape Fear River, because Federal cavalry had come all the way over from New Bern and hit Keaningsville, where the armory was. Well, Keaningsville's not that far from Fayetteville. So Colonel Childs got permission to raise some forces as security, as well as have some of these trenches, these nice works, constructed. Now, this is on private property, folks. Unfortunately, I don't know if we're going to be able to save them. But the problem with these works, they're on the opposite side of the river. Sherman's not coming from that direction. Sherman's coming from the west. So they're really useless. But Hampton is able to use some of them. Next slide, please. And on the morning of March 11th, you got the scouts in the lead here coming in, all the foragers and bummers are hanging out. But all that's left in town here is Wade Hampton and a few of his troopers and some of Wheeler's boys. Over here to the left is the 14th Corps from the left wing. Because the right wing had the honor of taking Columbia, Sherman gave the honor of Fayetteville to Henry Slocum. And the 14th Corps was supposed to do it, but Captain Duncan and his boys and all the foragers got in there first. And before you have it, you had this running street fight. As cavalry historian Eric Wittenberg would say, there's only 4 fights in the Civil War mounted that are in an urban environment. I mean, inside a town, inside streets. And the problem is, when all these mounted scouts and foragers get inside, they turn left to try to get away from Hampton, and they run into a dead end. So eventually all this breaks down. Duncan is captured by Hampton, tells him he's going to kill him because, one, he's a scout. Scouts are very borderline. Oh, your socks are blue. That's the only thing that makes you a Federal soldier. Got it. So he's a lot of civilian clothes. Hampton says he's a spy, but eventually Duncan will escape during the Battle of Averysboro. But you see how Hampton gets across the bridge here, the covered bridge across the Cape Fear. Here's those wonderful works that I was talking about. But like I said, they're orientated towards this direction, back towards the coast, not from this direction. But they're able to burn the bridge. The Federals are not able to capture it. They're going to have to put their engineering assets again. So in the morning of March 11th, Sherman now has Fayetteville. Next slide. And while he's in Fayetteville, they're going to destroy that wonderful arsenal. This is the remains of the Confederate arsenal. This is the 1st Michigan Engineers using the battering rams to bring down these beautiful stone walls. And oh, by the way, he's got to build engineers to get across the river. He's got about 5,000-6,000 non-combatants, like the ladies are hanging out at Howard's headquarters. He puts them on boats or marches them down here to Wilmington to be taken care of. So he's going to hang out in Fayetteville for 3 or 4 days. Next slide. Here's old Johnston. The good thing here is at least the sandbox is a lot smaller now. But he still don't know where Sherman's going. Coming out of Fayetteville, he tells Hardee, if Sherman moves towards Raleigh, General Hoke and D.H. Hill and Bragg will move to link up with you. If Sherman moves towards Goldsboro, you will move to link up with them. You see, Johnson is still trying to figure out where Sherman is going at this stage of the game. Next slide. And ultimately, we have the Battle of Averysboro. Then, of course, the big one, March 19th and 21st. And Sherman on the 22nd will move into Goldsboro, where he starts to get resupplied by the railroads from Wilmington and over here from Morehead City. Next slide. That was what I call a dance. Pretty chaotic situation for the Confederate chain of command. Imagine what the soldiers are thinking. I'm going to Goldsboro one day and Fayetteville the next. They're loving it. But it was a dance between the river. Before I get into the Q&A session, I just want to, we mentioned, I think John mentioned a little bit about Ann did. I got several tours coming up in Bentonville. There's another one because of the Monroe's Crossroads being canceled. That 17th, I will also do Fayetteville as well. Bentonville. I'll tell you, folks, if Bentonville was on your bucket list 10 years ago and you said, I've been there, you need to come back. Actually, this round table, we just opened several miles of walking trails that opened up some of the 14th Corps trenches it's always been closed to the public. And now some of the trenches from Hoke's division we're finally going to be able to get into. And the round table here funded a very nice interpretive panel on one of these trails, and thank you very much for doing that. But I do have a series of tours going up there. Next slide, just see me afterwards. You want to talk about it? And with that said, folks, I will open it up to Q&A.
Thank you, Wade. I think we're working on this now. We'll have questions from anyone here. Raise your hand. Ask that you wait for the... Yeah, I know. Just a second. Wait till you get the microphone so that, A, we can hear it on stage, and also we have people on Zoom so they get to hear the question also.
Folks, for those of you that are leaving, I understand. Thanks a lot for coming out. I really appreciate it, folks. Thank you.
Thank you. There's an old family story with McLeod's in Pinehurst, or actually Aberdeen back then. We had a farm, and Sherman, one of the branches, was headed towards Carthage, I believe. They were going to go to the buggy factory. I don't know if you're familiar with all that stuff, but I've heard that. And they couldn't find anything. They tried to get the purse from my grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, her young son stood between him, and he got pistol whipped, and he had the scar the rest of his life. And then they took the buggy. They got so mad about him, they chopped up the buggy and made a big bonfire. So anyway, I don't know if they went to Carthage or not, but I heard that was the story. Do you know anything about that? On the way towards Fayetteville. It's
Carthage?
not too far.
You just say Carthage?
Carthage,
Okay. Remember how General Hardee went north? And what I didn't tell you all, he was dragging 52 guns, artillery. Okay? He saved, remember, he couldn't save everything at Sherall, but he tried to save what he can. And these are not the guns that are used at Bentonville at Averysboro. These are reserved. There's 52 of them. Now, every gun is pulled by 4 to 6 horses. Every artillery piece has an ammunition chest that's being pulled, whatever. Imagine, do the math. Figure out how long that train is. That train was all the way up in Carthage, and a lot of other wagons he had. So they came through that area, got on the plank road, and came down through what would be Spring Lake today to get to Fayetteville. So you got Hampton and Kilpatrick going at it at Monroe's Crossroads on Fort Bragg, but to the north, where Carthage is, the road that comes over, there's a plank road that ran all the way down to Fayetteville. That's what they're on. Other questions?
Well, no, it's for the people on Zoom.
Yeah, okay, no problem. My question is regards to Braxton Bragg's performance in defense of Wilmington. When Fort Anderson was being attacked, where was he? I understand he had to go to Richmond to reorganize his staff. What's the real explanation?
He wasn't here. Bottom line is, well, where should a commander be in this crisis going on? I mean, send your adjutant general, send one of your staff officers up there. But you literally have the Union Navy sitting at the mouth of the Cape Fear. You've got the 23rd Corps that's flowed in from Tennessee that's reinforcing Terry, who took Fisher, who are now on this side of the river in Southport, and everyone's moving towards Anderson. And you got the Sugarloaf line that's very tenuous. That minute you punch it, it's almost like the Rivers Bridge, the Salkehatchie. The minute you just punch one hole In that Sugarloaf line, everyone flows through it. Guess what? The road to Wilmington is open. So where's he at? See, as what was the famous? Was it Mary Chestnut, the diarist, who said, yeah, "Well, there goes Wilmington." when she heard Bragg was putting charge down here, there goes Wilmington. Yeah, he's not where he needs to be. And honestly, it could be, I never really, and this is an assumption on my part, and it's a great question, but it made my brain trigger. I beg you, please remove me from this embarrassing situation. If Davis didn't answer the letter, is he now using an excuse to go face to face? I don't know. You got to love the Civil War, right? But it sure does. I mean, I just thought about that. Wow. You know? So there is a reason for Bragg to be there, because he don't want to work for Johnston. And you're not answering my mail, so I got to come see you. Maybe that's got something to do with it. But bottom line is, he's a senior commander. He should have been here. Next question.
Question that I have, you spoke about the communication issues that were between Johnston and Bragg and Hardee. Given the lateness in the war and the generals that Lee had to deal with down here, is there any real expectation that Lee should have had that they were going to communicate well? And
you know, that's a great question, because you remember D.H. Hill over in Augusta with the Army of Tennessee? Well, he's the senior officer that gets to Smithfield. And when Johnston makes that decision to reinforce success over in Kinston, Johnston's message to D.H. Hill was, I beg you, please forget the past for this emergency. You got a lot of stars down here in North Carolina, but you don't have very many Confederate privates. And unfortunately, a lot of them don't get along. And that's not the harmony that they needed. You don't see that in Sherman's army. You don't. This is not the army in Northern Virginia. You know, it's just not. Yeah, it's a bad situation.
Other questions?
You didn't mention very much about what Robert E. Lee was doing during this time, you know, in this Army of Northern Virginia. Now, his plans, I understand, were to join up with Johnston in Bentonville. Now, let's assume if Lee was able to do that, would that created a situation for another major battle?
No, I would tell you that Lee had no intention to link up with Johnston.
He did.
He can't. The minute he comes out in the open, and for him to go from Petersburg, Richmond, and get down here to North Carolina, his army is in the open. Grant unleashes Phil Sheridan and the cavalry on him.
But that's his intention to start.
No, that was suggested. Beauregard, in his beautiful way of thinking, hey, why don't you leave a little fixing force up there and come down here, we'll beat Sherman, then we'll unite and then move on up there. No, he couldn't. It's a great idea. It's a great idea, but it couldn't happen. And Lee knew that. Lee was fixed. It's what we say in the Army, you're fixed. And now his boys are spread thin in the trenches around Petersburg and Richmond. He doesn't have enough men to cover it. And that's why infusing Sherman's army there would extend it that he couldn't do it. But the problem is Lee understood he could not move out into the open. What happens once Petersburg and Richmond falls? What happens? Sailor's Creek and a few other things, gone. He's out in the open. It's lights out. He doesn't have the forces to compete.
The crater?
No.
Petersburg. Let me ask you one more question. How many people died in the Battle of Bentonville? And how many days?
It's fought 3 days, several thousand. Confederate casualties are somewhat problematic due to the record keeping at the end, but you've got several thousand casualties. I think we put out a total of 3,000. We did a candelabra out on one of the fields, you know, the white bag with a candle at night for every Union or Confederate soldier that was killed at the Battle of Bentonville, and it was pretty impressive. And when the jets from Seymour Johnson are coming in on a low overpass, they know what's going on. It's pretty cool.
Have you been to Bentonville lately?
Yes, sir. I volunteer there all the time. Yes, sir. Like I said, if it's on your bucket list, you need to come back.
Wade, the impact of railroads on this campaign. You know, in the Civil War, railroads are always very important. And you didn't mention a whole lot about railroads. Were they using them, or was it just all marching?
Well, it's
and
interesting.
whatever?
In South Carolina, we're going to destroy them. Sherman is going to destroy them. But once he gets into North Carolina, as one of Schofield's soldiers from Indiana would say, I'm used to tearing up railroads, not building railroads. The Atlantic in North Carolina and the Wilmington Weldon, Sherman knew were vital, because once all those guys united, you're talking almost 90,000 federal soldiers in the state of North Carolina. I don't care how many foragers and bummers you can steal out. You can only steal so many chickens and hams. You need a railroad that moves tons of food. So the railroads in North Carolina, Sherman did not destroy. It was all about repairing those and putting them back in order. South Carolina, Georgia, absolutely. Sherman's bow ties. Make sure we can't use them again. Good question.
Thank you, Wade.
Well, thanks again,
We
folks.
appreciate it. We do have books for sale up here, and Wade, ready to sign them for you if you'd like. Thank you.